They expected me to fade into the background of my father's mansion gala. But humiliation is never a whisper when it comes from family. My father shouted those words across the ballroom, his voice booming over the string quartet and the polite rehearsed laughter of 200 guests. "You'd be nothing without us," he declared. "You wouldn't last a week. Go ahead, walk away." My mother stood 3 feet away, her champagne flute frozen halfway to her lips. She said nothing. My brother laughed and called me a freeloader, not in confidence, not in private, but loudly enough for every guest in the immediate circle to hear. What they didn't realize was that I had already sent a single quiet text, and the next person to speak would fundamentally shift the power dynamic in that room. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me explain how I found myself standing in that ballroom and why the people who believed they knew me best were so profoundly wrong. The Davenport estate sat on the outskirts of Greenwich, Connecticut, perched on land my father acquired the moment his logistics company went public. Every December he hosted the Winter Foundation Gala. It was a black-tie affair for 300 guests, centered around a silent auction for a charity my mother hand-selected each year. Officially, the evening was about philanthropy. In reality, it was about positioning. This was the stage where my father reminded the world who he was and why his name held weight. He always made his entrance from the grand staircase, pausing at the landing just long enough to ensure the room took notice. I had witnessed that moment dozens of times growing up. I knew the timing. I knew the curated smiles. I knew which guests would be ushered upstairs afterward for private high-stakes conversations. I arrived alone. In my family, arriving alone meant arriving exposed. My brother Elliot had his wife Catherine by his side, her pedigree and background wealth quietly reinforcing everything my father valued. My mother moved through the crowd with practiced grace, greeting donors and maintaining alliances. And then there was me. I am 32 years old, no date, no official role, no introduction. No one asked what I did for a living. No one inquired about where I worked or how I supported myself. I had long since learned not to volunteer the information. In the past, such details were treated as curiosities at best and disappointments at worst. I was introduced simply as Margaret, followed by a pause that always felt deliberate. The gala followed its usual predictable rhythm. Waiters circulated with silver trays, conversations formed in familiar clusters, people laughed a bit louder than necessary. I moved through the room without stopping nodding when required listening more than speaking. I stayed near the terrace doors close enough to slip out if necessary, far enough to avoid being trapped in a conversation that would end in polite dismissal. My father's speech came late in the evening. He had been drinking. It wasn't enough to slur his words, but it was enough to loosen the restraint he usually kept on his temper. He thanked the guests, praised the charity, and spoke of legacy. Then the tone shifted. He talked about family and sacrifice, and then he looked directly at me. I recognized the look. I had seen it across dinner tables and in boardrooms. It meant he had decided to make an example of me. He didn't call me Margaret. He called me Maggie, the name he used when he was correcting me, not the one he used for people he respected. "Maggie thinks she can make it on her own," he said into the microphone. "She walked away from this family, walked away from everything we built. And what has she accomplished? Nothing. She'd be nothing without us. She wouldn't last a week if we cut her off. Go ahead, walk away, see how far you get." The room went still. It wasn't a polite silence. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. People shifted their weight, suddenly unsure of where to look. I didn't move. I sought out my mother near the stage. She was close enough to intervene, close enough to stop him. She didn't. Her face remained calm, controlled, and composed, the same expression she wore whenever something inconvenient occurred in public. My brother laughed. He tried to make it sound casual, but the edge was there. He leaned toward his wife and whispered something I couldn't catch. She looked at me and nodded. That look told me everything I needed to know. My father concluded his speech with a joke that landed poorly. The applause was scattered and thin. The music resumed too quickly to compensate for the tension. I didn't cry, I didn't flee, and I didn't confront him. Instead, I reached into my clutch and sent a message to my assistant. 6 words. No explanation. Then I put the phone away. Around me, the room began to reset. People resumed their conversations at a slightly higher pitch. My father accepted congratulations. My mother returned to her hosting duties. My brother lost interest the moment the spectacle stopped entertaining him. On the surface, nothing had changed. I stayed where I was watching. People passed by without noticing me, which was fine. I had learned how to operate in rooms like this without drawing attention. The gala continued exactly as it always had, but the message had been sent, and I remained exactly where I was. The gala drew to a close around midnight, but the humiliation didn't depart with the guests. I watched the last of them drift toward the valet station, their breath blooming in the December air, coats pulled tight as they leaned in to finish conversations they didn't want overheard. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the rhythm. The Davenport daughter. Did you see her face? I always knew there was tension. Poor thing. I had been their favorite gossip for years. Inside, the catering staff was already dismantling the evening. Tablecloths were stripped and folded into tall linen carts. Flower arrangements were boxed for donation. Champagne flutes rattled along stainless steel racks toward industrial dishwashers humming behind swinging doors. The string quartet had long since packed up. The silent auction items were being logged by my mother's assistant, Jennifer, who glanced at me once before quickly averting her eyes, as if my presence made her job more complicated. I should have left. Any reasonable person would have called a car and headed back to the city to an apartment I had earned and a life that existed entirely outside of this house. But I stayed, partly because I wasn't ready for the 2-hour drive back to Brooklyn, and partly because I wanted to hear what they would say once the audience was gone. My father found me in the library. I was standing by the window looking out at the darkened lawn where motion sensor lights flickered on and off as staff crossed the grounds. I used to play there as a child before I learned which achievements were praised and which choices were quietly logged as failures. He didn't apologize. I hadn't expected him to. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said. His voice was calm now, controlled. It was the tone he used in board meetings when the decision was final and discussion was no longer permitted. "Coming here alone, standing in the back like you didn't belong," he continued. "People notice those things. They start asking questions. They wonder what's wrong with the Davenport girl, why she can't keep a job, why she can't find a husband, why she drifts." He stopped by the desk and straightened a stack of books that hadn't been moved in years. I said nothing. Silence had become my default response in these exchanges. Any explanation was an invitation for cross-examination, and any defense was used as evidence against me. "Your mother and I gave you every advantage," he went on. "Education, connections, a place in this family. All you had to do was stay, show up, and instead you walked away from the company, from responsibility, from everything we built." He finally looked at me. "And now you show up at our events like you've earned the right to be here." I remained exactly where I had been since he entered. I hadn't shifted my weight or crossed my arms. I hadn't given him any reaction that might interrupt his momentum. "One failure," he added, his voice dropping. "That's what you represent." My brother appeared in the doorway before I could respond. His bow tie was undone, his jacket slung over one shoulder. Catherine had already gone upstairs. Elliot never missed these moments, not to help, but to reinforce. "Dad's right," he said, glancing at his watch. "You've been riding the family name for years, showing up when it suits you, taking the benefits without putting in the work." He leaned against the fireplace. "Every time someone asks about you, I have to explain it away. Maggie's doing her own thing. Maggie's figuring things out. You're 32. That stopped sounding charming after a while." I looked at the carpet near his shoes, focusing on a faint indentation in the fibers that had never quite recovered from years of foot traffic. I wanted to tell them that I had built something real, that people depended on me, that I hadn't figured things out in theory, but in contracts, deadlines, and consequences. I wanted to tell them that I had changed my professional name deliberately, that I had avoided their network on purpose, and that I had chosen the long way around so that no one could ever claim I owed my success to them. But I knew how that conversation would end. They would demand details. They would measure those details against standards they controlled. If my success didn't resemble theirs, it wouldn't count. So I said nothing. They accepted the silence as confirmation. My mother entered last. She had removed her jewelry and handed it off to the staff. The diamonds already returned to the safe, where they spent most of their existence. She looked tired, in a way she usually took great pains to conceal. "Your father wants what's best for you," she said, stepping between us without truly taking a side. "We all do. If you came back to the company and took a real role, you'd have stability, a future. This independent path, it's admirable, but it isn't sustainable." She waited as if expecting me to agree. I didn't. "Your choice," my father said, turning toward the sideboard and reaching for the decanter. "But don't expect us to keep supporting you if you won't support yourself. This family isn't a charity." I almost smiled. They had cut me off years ago. I hadn't taken a single dollar from them since I was 24. The account my mother believed was still funding my life had been closed the month I left the company. Every rent payment, every expense, and every risk I had taken since then came from work they never even asked about. They were threatening to withdraw support that no longer existed. I didn't correct them. I left the library without saying goodbye and walked down the driveway to my car. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and clarifying. My breath clouded the air as I unlocked the door. I sat there for a full minute before starting the engine, my hands resting on the steering wheel as I replayed the scene. My father's certainty, my brother's confidence, my mother's careful distance. They spoke to a version of me they no longer bothered to verify. I pulled out onto the road and headed toward the highway, the house disappearing in the rearview mirror faster than I expected. They had written about my role years ago. They just didn't know I had already stepped out of it. The morning after the gala, my phone began buzzing before the sun was up. Messages arrived from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months, aunts, cousins, and family friends who had heard about my father's speech and wanted to offer sympathy without actually disagreeing with him. "So sorry to hear about last night. You know how your father gets. I'm sure he didn't mean it the way it sounded. He meant exactly what it sounded like. Everyone knew that. But acknowledging it would have meant admitting that Richard Davenport had crossed a line, and no one in our family's orbit was willing to say that aloud. It was easier to soften the edges, to call it stress or a misunderstanding, a moment that simply got out of hand. My mother called at 9. I was already at my desk reviewing documents for a deal scheduled to close before the end of the year. Her voice was gentler than it had been the previous night, but the substance remained the same. "You know your father loves you," she said. "He just shows it differently. If you hadn't stood off by yourself looking miserable, he wouldn't have felt the need to address it publicly. You make things harder than they need to be, Margaret. You always have." I listened. I let her finish. I told her I understood and thanked her for calling. I said I would think about what she suggested. What she had suggested was that I call my father and apologize not for what he said, but for making him look bad. She framed it as a small concession, something that would restore order and allow everyone to move on. Order in this family meant silence. My brother texted an hour later. It was a link to an industry magazine profile with his photograph at the top. The headline praised Davenport Logistics expansion into international freight. There was no message attached. There didn't need to be. I opened the article and read it slowly. I skipped the quotes and ignored the praise. I focused on the 6th paragraph, where the financial details were listed: a strategic partnership, newly secured shipping lanes, and financing terms that stood out precisely because they were so generous. I recognized them immediately. My team had structured those terms. The deal had crossed my desk 3 months earlier. It was presented as a family-owned logistics company seeking growth capital, a standard proposal with clean numbers. It was nothing that required more than routine approval, and I had signed off without looking twice at the name. The ownership structure had obscured the connection with holding companies layered cleanly. There were no obvious red flags, but now with the benefit of context, the link was unmistakable. Capital from my firm had flowed through intermediaries into a company controlled by my father. He had no idea. None of them did. I didn't feel satisfaction, nor did I feel guilt. I noted the fact the same way I noted everything else that crossed my desk as information. I opened my calendar. The executive meeting was scheduled for later that morning. Daniel Brooks, CFO, Priya Sharma, Chief Legal Counsel, Marcus Williams, COO. They didn't call me Margaret or Maggie. They used the professional name I had chosen when I started the company, a name that didn't appear in family records and didn't surface in searches tied to Richard Davenport. The meeting took place in our financial district office. It was a neutral, functional space. A firm that managed several $1 billion didn't need to advertise the fact. Our clients valued discretion, and so did I. Daniel began with updates. The logistics consortium deal was on track. Capital was deployed, returns were above projection. There was a question at an industry event. He said, his tone carefully neutral. Someone noticed the connection between one of our portfolio companies and Davenport Logistics. Nothing concrete. I redirected. I nodded. Good. He didn't ask why. After the meeting, I stayed behind. The office was quiet. I looked out over the river, watching barges move slowly in the distance, steady and indifferent. Somewhere else in the city, my father was likely celebrating his expansion. Somewhere my brother was forwarding that article and collecting congratulations. They believed they were succeeding on their own terms. I closed the article and returned to my work. I could have said something months ago. I could have corrected their assumptions. I could have stopped my father before he ever stepped up to that microphone. Instead, I had done nothing. My phone buzzed again. A message from my mother. Your father is waiting for your call. I turned the phone face down and opened the next file on my screen. There was work to finish. The walk out of Davenport Logistics 7 years ago didn't feel like a definitive break. It was a sequence of cold administrative deletions. I remember the weight of the cardboard box in my arms, the way the tape scratched against my palms, and the dead silence of the hallway. My father was behind a mahogany door, likely reviewing the quarterly labor costs of 1,000 employees over Scotch, while I was being processed as a line item offboarding from the system. There were no tears, only the clinical reality of a checklist. I stood at the reception desk as a junior HR assistant revoked my key card, a physical act of deactivating my existence in their world. The shredder hummed nearby, devouring project files I had spent years building. The family myth says I couldn't handle the pressure, and my mother's text, that single word, disappointing, became the baseline for my first year. But they never saw the version of me that existed after that day. They didn't see the 2-room office in Brooklyn where the only measure of time was the cycle of my laptop charger and the dry ache in my eyes after 14 hours of staring at risk assessment spreadsheets. I remember one specific New Year's Eve 3 years into my failure. While the Davenport mansion was glowing with 300 guests and vintage Bollinger, I was sitting on a plastic crate in a room that smelled of dust and ozone. I was tracking the opening bell of the London Stock Exchange because a client's entire life savings depended on a hedging strategy I had designed. I wasn't just finding work. I was building a fortress out of data points and sheer refusal to lose. I traded my corner office for a desk I'd bought off a sidewalk. In those early months, I executed a series of high-risk recoveries. The most defining moment was a 3:00 a.m. call from the Port Authority of Savannah regarding a blocked shipment of medical components. The agent on the line didn't care about my last name. He only cared about the $400,000 discrepancy in the manifest and the fact that the docked freighter was costing $10,000 an hour in fines. I sat in the absolute silence of my office, watching the cursor blink on the tax ID field. My vision narrowed to the rows of logistics data. I had to choose between using my remaining cash reserves to cover the bond or losing the contract entirely. I authorized the transfer. I watched the digits in my bank portal drop to nearly zero a transaction that cleared my account but secured the asset. I had exactly $12 left to my name, barely enough for a week of cheap groceries and a subway fare. Carol Fitzgerald, who had been watching the deal from the sidelines, finally spoke after I sent the confirmation. "You have an eye for identifying leverage in a crisis, Margaret," she'd said. "But you also have the stomach to wait for the numbers to move back in your favor." I learned that I did. I spent the next years in the trenches working until the pixels of 10K filings burned into my retinas. While my brother was likely attending yacht races and posting about the weight of the crown, I was learning how to identify a lie on a balance sheet from 3 rooms away. I watched how giants fell not from lack of money, but from a failure to account for the actual data. There was no gathering storm to warn me of the scale I was reaching. There was only the relentless vibration of push notifications and flagged emails. While Elliot was collecting likes on social media for his leadership, I was adjusting shipping lanes and hedging currency risks across 3 continents. I occupied the space they assigned me. I attended every Christmas dinner as the disappointment a label that functioned as a perfect firewall. I listened to my brother boast about his visionary leadership while I confirmed the wire transfers for assets that eclipsed his entire world. I paid that tax for my freedom, letting them believe I was failing so I could build my own infrastructure in the gaps of their arrogance. On the night the Savannah freighter finally cleared the harbor and the first 40-fold return hit the accounts, I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I simply checked the time, closed the laptop, and started drafting the next set of acquisition terms. I had survived my father's week 7 years ago. Now I was just waiting for him to notice. The relationship between my company and my family's business was never supposed to exist. When my team first brought me the Davenport Logistics opportunity, the name didn't register. The proposal came through 3 layers of corporate intermediaries, standard practice in our industry, and the documents identified the target as DavCorp Holdings, a subsidiary of a subsidiary that handled international freight operations. I approved the deal the same way I approved dozens of others, by trusting my team's analysis, reviewing the numbers, and making a decision based on risk and return rather than relationships or sentiment. It wasn't until months later, when I saw my brother's magazine profile, that I realized the capital we'd provided was supporting my father's expansion plans. By then, the money had already moved. 3 tranches of investment capital, structured as convertible debt with favorable terms, had flowed through our partner funds into accounts controlled by entities that ultimately served Davenport Logistics. It was nothing illegal or improper, just a complex web of financial relationships that happened to connect 2 parts of my life that I had carefully kept separate. My first instinct was to unwind the position. I could have instructed Daniel to exit the investment, taking our capital elsewhere, and severing the connection before anyone discovered it. The loss would have been minimal, and the explanation simple: the risk profile had changed, and we were rebalancing our portfolio. It was a standard business decision that required no further justification. But I didn't. And the reason I didn't was more complicated than simple revenge. The truth was, Davenport Logistics was a good investment. My father had built something real, whatever his flaws as a person and a parent. The company's fundamentals were strong, the growth trajectory was promising, and the management team, my brother's weaknesses notwithstanding, was generally competent. If I exited the position, I would be making a decision based on emotion rather than analysis, and that was exactly the kind of thinking I had spent 7 years training myself to avoid. So I kept the investment. I didn't increase it. I didn't try to gain influence over the company's direction, and I didn't do anything that might complicate my professional obligations. I simply let the relationship continue as one of hundreds in our portfolio, generating returns that benefited our clients without any of them knowing they were profiting from the Davenport family's success. The irony sustained me during difficult moments. When my father called me worthless, I thought about the capital that was helping his company grow. When my brother called me a freeloader, I considered the favorable terms he was enjoying without any awareness of their source. They thought they were self-made and independent, owing nothing to anyone outside their charmed circle. They had no idea that the daughter they dismissed was quietly contributing to their prosperity. But financial relationships have a way of becoming complicated, and the weeks after the gala brought complications I hadn't anticipated. It started with a routine compliance review. One of our institutional investors, a European pension fund, was conducting due diligence on their investment with us. It was standard practice, except that their auditors were more thorough than most. They began tracing the ownership structures of our portfolio companies, mapping connections between entities, and looking for anything that might create a conflict of interest or regulatory concern. Daniel brought me the preliminary findings on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the gala. His expression told me everything before he spoke. "They found the Davenport connection," he said. Not directly, not yet, but they're asking questions about DavCorp holdings that are getting closer. If they map the full ownership structure, they'll see your family name, and then they'll want to know why we invested in a company connected to our managing partner without disclosing the relationship. I had disclosed the relationship technically. When I first discovered the link, I filed the appropriate paperwork with our compliance team, documenting the family connection and confirming that the investment decision had been made without knowledge of that link. It was all legal proper and defensible. But defensible and comfortable were different things. If the auditors found the connection, there would be questions, explanations would be required. My carefully maintained separation between my professional and personal lives would start to erode. "What are our options?" I asked. "We could exit the position now," Daniel said. "Take a small loss, attribute it to changing market conditions, and move on before anyone digs deeper. Or we could disclose proactively, get ahead of the story, and control the narrative. Or we could do nothing," I said. "Let the auditors find what they find, answer their questions honestly, and trust that the documentation protects us. That's riskier if they think we were hiding something. We weren't hiding anything. We followed the procedure. The only thing I've hidden is from my family, and that's not anyone's business but mine." Daniel nodded slowly. He had known me long enough to understand that family was a subject I didn't discuss, a door I kept firmly closed. He had never asked why, and I had never volunteered an explanation. But he was smart enough to see the outlines of the story, the distance I kept from my relatives, and the way I flinched whenever the Davenport name came up in conversation. "There's something else," he said. "Your brother has been making inquiries about our firm. Nothing direct, but he's been asking around trying to find out who's behind some of the deals his company has benefited from. I think he suspects there's a silent partner somewhere, and he wants to know who it is." This was new. This was dangerous. My brother was many things: arrogant, dismissive, entitled. But he wasn't stupid. If he was asking questions about the source of his company's recent good fortune, it meant he had noticed something that didn't add up. The terms were too favorable. The timing was too convenient. Something in the deal structure had caught his attention, and now he was pulling at threads that could unravel everything. "How close is he?" I asked. "Not close. He's looking in the wrong direction, focused on competitors who might be trying to gain influence over Davenport. He hasn't considered the possibility that the investor might be someone with a personal connection. Why would he? As far as he knows, you're a failure living off family scraps." The contempt in Daniel's voice was subtle but unmistakable. He had met my family exactly once at a charity event where my father had treated him like a servant, and he had harbored a quiet dislike ever since. "Let him look," I said. "If he finds anything, it will only be the truth. And the truth is that his company accepted capital on terms we offered without any coercion or deception. There's nothing improper here. Except that when he finds out it was you, if he finds out it was me, I'll deal with it then. For now, we proceed as planned. Don't exit the position. Don't proactively disclose, and don't do anything that looks like we're trying to hide. If the auditors ask questions, answer them honestly, and if my brother comes knocking—" Daniel waited. "Let me know," I said. "I'll handle it myself." That afternoon, my father called me. It was not to apologize for the gala or to inquire about my well-being, but to boast. The international expansion was proceeding ahead of schedule. Contracts had been signed that would double Davenport Logistics' presence in Asian markets. He was being profiled in another business publication, this one focused on family dynasties and generational wealth. "I thought you should know," he said, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who believed he was rubbing salt in a wound. "While you're struggling to pay your rent, we're building something that will outlast all of us. Something your brother will inherit. Something that will be in the Davenport name for generations." I congratulated him, told him I was proud, and made all the appropriate noises of a dutiful daughter. And when I hung up the phone, I looked out my window at the Manhattan skyline and allowed myself a small private smile. He had no idea. None of them did. And when the truth finally emerged, it wouldn't be because my brother's investigations had uncovered it, or because an auditor had traced the ownership structures, or because I had slipped up and revealed what I'd been hiding. It would be because I chose to reveal it. on my terms, in my time. And there would be nothing they could do but watch as everything they thought they knew came crashing down around them. The email arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks before the incident that would change everything. It was flagged by my assistant as urgent, the kind of message that bypassed routine filters and landed directly at the top of my inbox. The subject line was harmless enough: Compliance Update Portfolio Review. The contents were not. One of our institutional investors had escalated their inquiry. The European pension fund that had begun tracing Davcorp Holdings had decided the answers provided so far were insufficient. They wanted a full ownership disclosure, every entity, every beneficial interest, every potential conflict mapped cleanly and comprehensively. This wasn't paranoia. New regulations had tightened disclosure standards across the industry, and pension funds were especially sensitive to reputational exposure. They weren't protecting themselves from wrongdoing. They were protecting themselves from association. From me. Daniel briefed me first, then Priya, then Marcus. Each of them laid out the same 3 options dressed in different languages. We could provide full disclosure and invite scrutiny we hadn't sought. We could refuse and risk the fund withdrawing and possibly alerting others. Or we could exit the Davenport position quietly, eliminating the conflict while signaling that something was wrong. Every path carried a cost. None of them were clean. What none of them could quantify was the personal risk. If this broke the wrong way, it wouldn't just be Hawthorne under review. It would be me, my name finally disentangled from my family, pulled back into their orbit. Every introduction I had earned without inheritance would acquire an invisible asterisk. Every decision would be reinterpreted through blood instead of judgment. I thought about the 7 years I had spent building a life where my last name didn't matter, about choosing anonymity over recognition, about letting my family believe I was failing so I could succeed without being claimed. If this became public on someone else's timeline, I wouldn't just lose capital or investors. I would lose authorship of my own story. While I was weighing these choices, my family was having problems of their own. My brother's expansion strategy had attracted regulatory attention in 2 jurisdictions. The financing terms that had enabled his growth were now under review, where the capital came from, how it was structured, and who ultimately stood behind it. I didn't hear about this through family channels. I heard it the way real information travels sideways through people who had nothing to gain by lying. Something's off with Davenport Logistics, a contact at a competing firm mentioned casually over coffee. Might be nothing, might not. Worth watching. I nodded, offered a neutral response, and filed it away. I was not just watching. Through layers of structure and distance, I was part of what was being watched. If regulators followed the trail far enough, they would find the connection. And if they did, the separation I had spent years constructing would collapse in a way I couldn't control. I called an emergency meeting with my executive team. Priya walked us through the regulatory exposure. Marcus outlined the operational fallout. Daniel presented exit scenarios and their financial impact. When the meeting ended, I asked everyone to leave except Priya. "What's the worst case?" I asked. She didn't soften it. Enforcement review. 2 years, 8 figures in legal fees. Even if we win, reputational damage. Investors hesitate. Growth slows. We survive, but smaller. And the best case, the inquiry fades. The connection never becomes public. Your family keeps believing you're irrelevant. You keep building in peace. Neither outcome felt acceptable. "There's a third option," I said. Priya looked at me carefully. "We control the disclosure, not with regulators, not with investors, with my family. On our terms, before anyone else defines it for us." "That's personal," she said. "It's strategic," I replied. "If they find out through filings or headlines, they'll have time to spin it, to frame it, to make it about them. But if I tell them myself publicly without warning, their reaction becomes the truth." She nodded slowly. "And once it's out, there's no going back." I'm not interested in going back. The winter charity circuit was approaching. Neutral ground, familiar faces. The same audience that had watched my father humiliate me weeks earlier. I didn't need to force the moment. I just needed to be ready when it arrived. That confirmation came sooner than expected. Elliot bypassed proper channels and contacted one of our partner firms directly. He hadn't traced the structure far enough to find me, but far enough to know something was there. The managing director called me within the hour. "Your brother is asking questions," she said. "He doesn't know what he's looking for yet, but he will." That was the line. The revelation was coming whether I wanted it or not. The only choice left was whether I would control it or be exposed by it. I closed my calendar, confirmed my attendance at the Winter Industry Summit, and began making preparations. Control wasn't gone yet, but it was slipping. My father's declaration at the gala became the background radiation of my life. "You wouldn't last a week." It wasn't a warning. It was a verdict delivered with the arrogance of a man who believed the world began and ended at the gates of his estate. 6 days had passed since that night. I spent them not in panic, not in recovery, but in a state of deliberate surgical execution. In high finance, a week is an eternity if you understand how to move pieces without drawing attention to your hands. The first phase of my preparation was internal. I initiated a series of quiet adjustments to our portfolio, tightening the covenants attached to the debt held by Davcorp Holdings. I didn't trigger a default. That would have been crude. Instead, I increased the reporting requirements. Every 48 hours, my father's team now had to submit granular operational data from their Asian terminals, fuel hedging positions, port fees, crew utilization ratios. On paper, it was routine governance. In reality, I was forcing them to stare directly at their own vulnerabilities, even if they didn't yet know who was holding the magnifying glass. The second phase was visibility. For 7 years, I had operated as a ghost, a name buried in filings, a silent presence in boardrooms that never needed my voice to move. That week, I began to materialize. I accepted invitations to 3 industry gatherings I would normally have declined. I didn't linger at the edges. I stood in the center of rooms, my Hawthorne Capital badge clearly visible, engaging with the exact people my brother had been trying and failing to impress. I wasn't posturing. I was establishing a trail. By the time the Winter Industry Summit arrived, my name would already be circulating in the right conversations, fully disentangled from the Davenport legacy. My father called midweek. It was the first time we had spoken since the confrontation in the library. His voice carried a new edge, sharp, irregular. "I was at the club today," he said, skipping any attempt at greeting. "Some associates mentioned your name. They said you were connected to a donation for the Metropolitan Arts Council. A significant one." I leaned back in my chair, eyes on the spreadsheet glowing on my monitor. The donation had been a calculated move made months earlier, entry capital for a board seat that mattered. "Must be a mistake, Dad," I said evenly. "I can't afford that kind of exposure." "That's exactly what I told them," he snapped. "I told them they had the wrong Margaret. But don't let it happen again. I won't have people thinking I'm still subsidizing your social ambitions." He hung up before I could respond. There it was, the crack. A faint tremor of doubt buried under aggression. He was overcorrecting. My father relied on his internal map of the world being accurate. I was becoming a landmark he couldn't explain. My mother called the next morning. She was the scout sent to probe under the cover of concern. "We just want what's best for you, Margaret," she said softly. "Your father is willing to overlook the embarrassment of the gala if you'll just come home for a few days. We can talk about your future. There's a role for you in the company if you just stop trying to prove this point." "I'll think about it, Mom," I replied. "I'm tied up with a few projects right now." I wasn't thinking about coming home. I was thinking about the summit. Neutral ground, high altitude, a place where my father was a guest and I was a peer. The week closed with Elliot's first tangible setback, a partnership he'd been cultivating for 6 months, a critical hinge in his Asian expansion stalled without warning. The other party cited transparency concerns related to Davenport's debt-to-equity ratio. Elliot didn't know those concerns had been flagged by an automated risk assessment tool developed by Hawthorne Capital and quietly shared with our primary banking partners. We hadn't targeted him. We had raised the standards of the entire network. He was failing because he was still playing by old rules in a market that had already moved on. I heard he was furious, spending his nights in the office, hunting for the ghost blocking his path. I spent the final evening of that week in my Brooklyn apartment. No string quartets, no velvet drapes, just a wall-to-wall view of the Manhattan skyline, jagged, illuminated, indifferent. A city that rewarded precision, not pedigree. 7 years of strategic silence were coming to an end. My father had said I wouldn't last a week without the Davenport safety net. That week was over. I was still standing, and I was no longer invisible. The summit began the next morning. I closed my laptop. The blue light faded into the dark. I was ready. The Winter Industry Summit at the Waldorf Astoria bore no resemblance to the sentimental ritual of the Davenport Gala. This was a high-altitude ecosystem where power was measured in basis points, liquidity, and access, not lineage, not tradition, and certainly not the age of a family wine cellar. The crystal chandeliers still hung from the ceiling, but here they functioned less as heirlooms and more as stage lighting for the theater of global finance. I arrived early. Not out of nerves, out of advantage. Early arrival meant the room was still fluid. Alliances had not yet calcified over drinks. Conversations were still exploratory, not performative. I could observe without being absorbed, map the terrain before the power centers locked into place. At the registration kiosk, I checked my badge. Margaret Davenport, Managing Partner, Hawthorne Capital. The weight of it surprised me, not emotionally, but physically. 7 years of anonymity had conditioned me to move without friction. This was different. This was visible. By the time my father and Elliot entered the ballroom had filled with navy wool low voices and the particular murmur of money speaking to money. They arrived with the confidence of men accustomed to being assumed important. My father drifted toward a familiar cluster of regional bank presidents. Elliot split off immediately, scanning the room for leverage for advantage for the next door that might open. Neither of them looked for me. In their version of reality, I was still in error term, someone safely irrelevant. Daniel Brooks appeared at my side with a glass of mineral water. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. "The primary investors are already here," he said quietly. "They're watching." I nodded. Then the timing holds. The catalyst came inevitably from Elliot. He was angling toward the bar when he nearly collided with Daniel. Annoyance flashed across his face, then calculation as his eyes dropped to Daniel's badge. Hawthorne Capital. I saw the recognition sharpen behind his eyes. This was the name that had stalled his progress for weeks. Brooks Wright Elliott said, his tone smooth but entitled. "I've been trying to get a meeting with your firm for over a month. Your office said you were selective." Daniel's expression didn't change. "We are. We tend to prioritize transparency and sustainable debt structures, Mr. Davenport." Elliott's jaw tightened, the tell he never noticed in himself. "I'm Elliot Davenport. Davenport Logistics is currently one of the most aggressive expansion stories in the sector. I think you'll find our numbers speak for themselves." It was then that his gaze shifted past Daniel and landed on me. The reaction was unguarded. Confusion first, then disbelief, then irritation blooming slowly into something sharper. "Maggie," he said, his voice cracking just enough to draw attention. "What are you doing here? This isn't a family function." Before I could respond, Carol Fitzgerald stepped in. She didn't acknowledge Elliot, not even with a glance. "Margaret," she said, taking my hand with the ease of long familiarity, "I've been looking for you. The board reviewed your proposal for the sovereign fund acquisition. Exceptional execution." She leaned in slightly enough for the surrounding circle to hear. "We'll need to discuss your Davenport exposure later. It's becoming a focal point of Q1 strategy." Elliot froze. He looked at my badge again, then at Carol, then back at me. This version of me didn't exist in his mental model. Appear to the woman he had been trying and failing to reach for years. Someone spoken to, not spoken over. I offered him a brief nod. "Professional. Final. Excuse me, Elliot. I have work to do." I left him standing by the bar, holding a realization he wasn't ready to process. Later, I approached my father. He was mid-conversation with the chairman of a regional bank, one of the institutions holding a meaningful portion of Davenport Logistics' senior debt. "Margaret," the chairman said warmly when he saw me. He turned to my father, whose expression had already begun to harden. "Richard, I didn't realize your daughter was the managing partner behind Hawthorne Capital. I was just telling her that your firm's execution on the consolidated project stabilized the entire syndicate." My father stared at him. "You know my daughter?" he asked carefully. "My daughter, the banker," echoed surprised. I had no idea there was a family connection. Margaret never mentioned it. She's built her reputation entirely on performance. I watched my father's hand tighten around his glass. For decades, he had told me I was nothing without his name. Now he was being told publicly, casually, that his name was the only thing the market hadn't associated with me. The Davenport hierarchy was built on the assumption that I was dependent. In this room, that hierarchy had no standing. I wasn't a daughter asking for recognition. I was the managing partner holding paper on his expansion, standing in a room where facts outweighed blood. The night continued. Conversation shifted, people recalibrated, but the transfer of control had already occurred. Power doesn't announce itself when it moves. It simply changes hands. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no moment where the room stopped, no dramatic pivot that demanded attention. Power rarely moves that way. Instead, it redistributed itself quietly through patterns, who people stood beside, who they waited for, and who they stopped interrupting. At some point, without anyone naming it aloud, the room recalibrated around me. Executives who had passed my father for decades with reflexive deference now paused mid-conversation to ask if they could be introduced. Not politely. Intentionally. They wanted to know where Hawthorne Capital was positioning for Q2, how we were stress-testing exposure in emerging markets, and why a firm with several billion under management had managed to remain structurally invisible. I answered without urgency, without warmth that invited intimacy. I spoke the way people expect principals to speak, precise, contained, uninterested in impressing anyone. When the Davenport connection surfaced, I acknowledged it only as a matter of record, not a credential, not a point of pride, just background noise. Within an hour, the narrative that had defined my place in that family collapsed under its own weight. I watched my father from across the ballroom. He was still circulating, still performing the muscle memory of influence, but something fundamental had shifted. His gestures had tightened. His posture had lost its expansiveness. Conversations that once bent toward him now curved away, inevitably redirecting toward me. Every time he tried to reclaim the center, someone mentioned Hawthorne. Every time he attempted to reassert authority, someone asked for my opinion. He had spent 30 years being the man who knew something others didn't. Tonight, he was learning publicly that he had been wrong about the one thing closest to him. Elliot unraveled faster. Where my father retreated into rigid silence, Elliot became loud, erratic. He started interrogating people, mid-drink, analysts, associates, junior partners, trying to reconstruct my career in real time. He needed a flaw, a shortcut, a patron, something that would allow him to categorize me as an exception instead of a superior. The moment that sealed it came quietly. A senior partner from one of the Big Four accounting firms approached our group. He was the lead on the European pension fund audit, the same inquiry that had triggered this chain reaction weeks earlier. He didn't acknowledge my father. He didn't look at Elliot. He addressed me directly. "Margaret," he said with the calm authority of someone who dealt in regulatory consequences, "we've reviewed Hawthorne's disclosure regarding the Davenport position. The debt layering is complex, but the asset fundamentals are sound. I'd like to discuss the compliance roadmap for the Q1 filing." I stepped forward, placing myself physically between him and my family. We spoke in the language of beneficial interest, cross-border reporting thresholds, and disclosure timing. I didn't simplify. I didn't slow down. I didn't check to see if anyone else was following the conversation. I didn't need to. When he moved on, my father turned toward me. "When did this happen?" he asked, his voice low and uneven. "How long have you been doing this behind my back?" "I haven't been behind your back," I said evenly. "I've been building a firm for 7 years. 7 years. I watched the arithmetic hit him, the holidays, the dismissals, the assumptions he had repeated while I was quietly accumulating the capital that kept his company solvent. My mother stepped in, then her hand resting on his arm. She was composed, but her eyes had changed. "Margaret," she said carefully, Why didn't you tell us? I met her gaze. Because you weren't listening. And because every time I spoke about my work, you treated it as evidence that I was failing. I paused. It turns out the Davenport standard wasn't the benchmark I thought it was. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was destabilizing. Late in the evening, Elliot found me near the bar. He looked exhausted, smaller. How long, he asked. A while. When Dad said those things at the gala, he continued quietly. You just stood there. I let him say what he believed, I replied. Correcting him wasn't my responsibility. Finishing the acquisition was. Daniel Brooks appeared beside me, seamless as ever. The consortium is ready, Margaret, he said. We're on schedule. I nodded, then looked at my brother one last time. Excuse me, Elliot. I have work to do. I walked away without looking back. I had spent 7 years operating in the dark, not hiding, but preparing. Tonight the room had finally adjusted to my presence. The final revelation hadn't even happened yet, but they already knew. I wasn't passing through. The summit had entered its final hour, the air thick with the scent of high-grade espresso and the low hum of deals being finalized in the margins of the room. My family remained anchored to the spot, a cluster of frozen privilege. My father was unable to leave without answers, and Elliot was unable to stop watching me as if I might vanish if he blinked. I was finishing a conversation with a representative from a Tier 1 sovereign wealth fund when the managing director of a competing logistics giant approached our circle. He had been watching the evening's shifting tides with undisguised curiosity. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and right now he wanted the identity of the person holding the leash on his biggest rival. I've been trying to solve a puzzle all night, he said, interrupting with the casual rudeness of someone who assumes his time is the most valuable in the room. He looked at my father, then at me. The financing structure behind the recent Davenport Logistics expansion project Horizon. I've traced the debt tranches back to this shop, but the beneficial ownership is opaque. Who is actually behind the capital? The question acted like a physical weight. My father drifted closer, his eyes narrowing. Elliot stepped in his face, pale, his breath hitched. This was the question he had been trying to answer for weeks. This was the shadow he had been chasing. Daniel Brooks appeared at my side as if summoned by the gravity of the moment. He didn't look at me, and he didn't need to. We had rehearsed this silence for 7 years. The managing director turned to Daniel. Brooks, you're the CFO at Hawthorne. You'd know better than anyone. Who is the beneficial owner of the funds supporting Davenport? Daniel's expression was a masterpiece of professional composure, central, detached, and utterly certain. He paused just long enough for the conversations nearest us to die down, for the ripples of attention to spread outward. She pays me, Daniel said. He didn't point. He didn't gesture. But the way he stood half a step behind me, his posture and admission of subordinate rank left no room for interpretation. The room didn't fall silent with a dramatic gasp. It was a gradual, systemic realization. For my father, the effect was seismic. His daughter, the failure, the freeloader, the girl he had publicly dismantled at his own gala, was the silent partner who had provided the blood for his company's expansion. She pays me wasn't a comment on a salary. It was a declaration of authority. It meant that Daniel Brooks, a man my father had treated like a servant, answered to my capital. It meant that every contract Elliot had signed, every visionary move he had made, had been enabled by my discretion. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. The judgment, the verdicts, the certainties he had carried for decades had simply evaporated. Elliot went a shade of gray I hadn't seen since the 2008 crash. You knew it was us, my father said, his voice a jagged whisper. I ran the numbers, I replied, my voice perfectly steady. I described his empire with the clinical detachment of a doctor reading a chart. Davenport Logistics has strong fundamentals. It was a solid, risk-adjusted return for my clients. Your company is a high-performing asset, Dad. Nothing more. You've been funding us, Elliot managed to say. He looked like he was struggling to find air. The expansion, the international berths. It was you. You didn't ask about my work, I said, finally looking him in the eye. You assumed you knew everything that mattered about me, and you were wrong. You mistook my silence for absence." My father tried to summon a final spark of his old self. "This doesn't change anything. You walked away from this family. You made your choice." "I did," I agreed, offering him a nod of acknowledgement. "And given the view from here, it was the best investment I ever made." I didn't wait for the fallout. I turned to Daniel, gave him a brief instruction for the morning's opening bell, and walked toward the exit. I could feel my family's eyes on my back, a weight I had carried since childhood, but tonight that weight was gone. The truth was out. The roles had been reversed. And as I stepped into the crisp New York night, I realized that I wasn't just stepping out of the room. I was stepping out of their story entirely. I have corrected the minor error in Chapter 11. The text is now 100% clean English, with all Vietnamese phrases removed and the tone maintained for professional delivery. The aftermath of the summit was quieter than I had expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no tearful phone calls, and no family meetings convened to address what had been revealed. Just silence, the particular silence of people who didn't know what to say. I returned to my normal routine the day after the event. Early morning meetings, portfolio reviews, and the steady rhythm of work that had sustained me through years of family drama. The world hadn't changed because my secret was out. Deals still needed to close. Clients still needed attention. The machinery of finance continued turning regardless of what the Davenport family now knew about their daughter. But beneath the surface, shifts were occurring. The first sign came from my father's business associates, the men and women who had attended the summit and witnessed the revelation. Their communications with Davenport Logistics became more guarded, more professional, and less warm. It was nothing overt or something that could be called a snub, just a subtle recalibration of relationships that had previously seemed secure. My brother felt it most acutely. His networking, which was always aggressive, had relied on an unspoken assumption that the Davenport name carried weight. That association with his family was a benefit rather than a complication. Now that assumption was in question. The sister they had dismissed was revealed to be a major player in the same circles they were trying to cultivate. The family narrative of unified success was shown to be incomplete at best and false at worst. I learned about these developments not from my family, but from the industry gossip that percolated through my network. A partner at a law firm mentioned that Elliot's calls were being returned more slowly than before. A banker noted that a deal Davenport Logistics had been pursuing had suddenly become more complicated. These were small things, individually insignificant, but together they painted a picture of influence quietly eroding. My mother reached out first. It was a carefully worded text message asking if we could meet for lunch. "Just the two of us," she specified, "away from your father and brother." I agreed more out of curiosity than any expectation of reconciliation. We met at a restaurant in the city neutral territory, far from Greenwich and far from my offices. She looked older than she had at the gala, as if the intervening weeks had aged her in ways I couldn't quite define. "I didn't know," she said after we had ordered. "I want you to understand that. I knew you had left the company, and I knew you were doing something in the city, but I never imagined that I might succeed without your help." She flinched at the words, but didn't deny their accuracy. "We assumed things about you that weren't true, your father especially, but all of us. We saw what we expected to see." "You saw what was convenient to see," I corrected her. "A failure made you feel better about your choices. A successful daughter would have complicated the story you told yourselves." She didn't argue. She sipped her water and looked out the window at the passing pedestrians, ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware of the quiet drama being played out at our table. "Your father is proud," she said finally. "Prouder than he knows how to admit. Finding out that you achieved what you did without his help or his guidance, it shook something in him. He doesn't know how to process it. He doesn't need to process it. He just needs to accept it." She nodded slowly. "He may never be able to do that. But I wanted you to know that I see you now. I see what you built, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." It was more than I had expected from her. It wasn't enough to heal years of dismissal, but it was something, an acknowledgement that the fault had not been mine. I thanked her for lunch for her honesty and for the effort it must have taken to reach out. And then I left, walking back through the city streets toward my office and the life I had built without her approval. My brother's reckoning came differently. He called me a week after my lunch with our mother, his voice stripped of the arrogance I had grown accustomed to. "I need to understand something," he said without preamble. "The financing you provided. Was it intended to help us or to gain leverage over us?" "It was intended to generate returns for my investors," I told him honestly. "Your company happened to be a good opportunity. Family had nothing to do with it." "But you could have told us. You could have given us a chance to respond, to understand what was happening. Would you have listened?" He was silent for a long moment. "Probably not," he admitted. "I would have assumed you were exaggerating or that someone else was really behind it. I would have found a way to dismiss it. Which is exactly why I didn't tell you." He exhaled heavily. "I spent my whole life believing I was the successful one, the one who carried on Dad's legacy and built on what he started. And the whole time you were quietly becoming more successful than any of us. How am I supposed to reconcile that?" "You don't have to reconcile it," I said. "You just have to live with it." The call ended without resolution, but something had shifted between us. It wasn't friendship or even reconciliation, but perhaps the beginning of an acknowledgement that the story he had told himself about our relative positions was not the only possible version. My father never called. I hadn't expected him to. His pride would not permit him to reach out to the daughter who had proved him wrong, and I had no interest in forcing a conversation he wasn't ready to have. Instead, we communicated through silence, through the absence of the attacks that had once been constant, and through a mutual agreement to keep our distance while we both adjusted to the new reality. The power that had once flowed so naturally toward Richard, Davenport began to dissipate. It wasn't dramatic or catastrophic, but it was steady, like water finding new channels when an old path becomes blocked. His company was still successful, and his reputation was still substantial, but the aura of invincibility that had surrounded him for decades was gone. And in its place, something new was growing. It wasn't my power over him, nothing so crude as dominance or revenge, but a simple equality. It was the recognition that I was no longer his dependent, no longer his disappointment, and no longer the failure he could point to as evidence of his own superior judgment. I had become someone he had to take seriously. That was revenge enough. The morning after everything changed looked like any other weekday. I woke up at 6, made coffee, scanned the news, and opened my calendar. Meetings were still there. Deadlines hadn't moved. Nothing on the schedule suggested that a family hierarchy had quietly collapsed the night before. Still, something was different. Late that morning, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my father. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't an invitation. It was just a short note saying we should talk at some point when it was convenient for me. The wording mattered. He was asking, not instructing. That alone told me more than any speech could have. I replied that I would reach out when I had time. I meant it not because I felt obligated, but because I no longer felt the need to avoid him. Hiding had served its purpose. It wasn't necessary anymore. Over the next few months, things shifted in small, unremarkable ways. My brother became quieter in meetings and more careful with his words. He asked questions instead of assuming he already knew the answers. It wasn't a transformation, just an adjustment, but it was noticeable. My mother became the point of contact between us. She passed along updates, suggested lunches, and mentioned events without pressure. For the first time, she didn't try to frame reconciliation as something I owed. She let the distance exist without trying to close it. My father stayed distant, proud, controlled, and careful. But the public remarks stopped. The dismissive jokes disappeared. When we were in the same room, he treated me with formality and restraint. We didn't revisit the past or discuss business. We acknowledged each other's presence and left it at that. That was enough. Work continued the way it always had. The regulatory review closed without findings. Our disclosures were validated. Investors stayed and deals closed. The company moved forward unaffected by family revelations that had once felt enormous. The real change wasn't external. For years I had managed two versions of myself, one for my family and one for the world I actually lived in. Keeping them separate had required constant effort, careful omissions, and strategic silence. That effort is gone now. I didn't have to explain or conceal anything. I could simply answer questions directly and let the facts stand on their own. I thought back to what my father had shouted that night, that I would be nothing without them, and that I wouldn't last a week. He was wrong about the outcome. But he was right about one thing: walking away had consequences. It forced me to build something on my own terms, without approval and without a safety net. That work shaped me more than comfort ever could have. I no longer needed that conflict to keep going. The work had its own momentum now. On the anniversary of the gala, my father hosted another event. It was smaller and quieter. He invited me directly, not through my mother, and not as an afterthought. I went. The evening was restrained. There was no spectacle and no grand statement. He spoke briefly, thanked the guests, and kept the focus on the event. When his speech ended, he met my eyes across the room and nodded once. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't warm. It was an acknowledgement. Later, we spoke for a few minutes. He asked about my work, and I answered. He listened without interrupting. When the conversation ended, he said something he had never said before. "I was wrong about you." That was all. It didn't erase the past or repair everything, but it was honest. I left that night without needing anything more from him. The point had never been to embarrass my family or take something from them. It was about dismantling the version of me they had relied on for years, the failure, the dependent, and the one they could dismiss without consequence. That version no longer existed. If you've stayed with this story, you probably recognize something in it. Maybe you've been underestimated by the people who were supposed to know you best. Maybe you've kept parts of your life small to avoid conflict. Maybe you've been told directly or indirectly that you wouldn't make it on your own. You don't have to prove anything to people who have already decided who you are. Sometimes the most effective response is silence. Sometimes it's distance. Sometimes it's building a life that speaks for itself. If this story resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I read them. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, you know what to do. They said I would be nothing without them. I kept going anyway.